some time ago, when we published the report and I was preparing my chapter, I was reflecting on the title, and I choose this: should I go or should I stay? And it really, I think, is a very fitting title to the dynamic that we see at play. So let's dive into the mobilization, or the potential mobilization, of foreign terrorist fighters after the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. I'm sure that most of you know a lot about Afghanistan already, so I will not stop on that topic much more, but just to remind ourselves of the context. Afghanistan is, of course, a historically very attractive destination for foreign fighters. At the time fighting the Soviets, they managed to mobilize around 30,000 foreign fighters, and several thousand of those still remain in Afghanistan. So I do think it's important to have that in mind. Also recently, the United Nations found that approximately 20 foreign terrorist fighters groups were still operating in the country. So the question that I posed myself to work on the chapter at the time was really, so having in mind the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, will the country become a new safe haven for foreign terrorist fighters? Will there be a new mass mobilization? And there were some indications. So, for example, after the Taliban takeover, there was really a sense of moral victory in jihadist and Salafist circles. There was a kind of morale boost in the sense of they managed to kick out the Americans. So there was a lot of chatter about how great that kind of event was for the larger community. Also, I think it's important to mention that in the past years, the Middle East as a destination for potential foreign terrorist fighters has, of course, become much less attractive, considering the territorial and also military decline of the Islamic State and other groups there. Also, considering that Afghanistan is, at least to some countries, to some individuals, geographically much closer than Syria and Iraq, and also much closer than countries in Western Africa. So that also might add to a more of an attractiveness as a destination for those traveling for jihadist purposes. And then also ISKP has been actively building networks in countries around Afghanistan, so Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, as well as Tajikistan. On the right, you see that in July last year was reported that IS had launched a new propaganda network for Tajik speaking individuals, and has also launched several other media operations in that direction. And then finally, also radicalization factors in countries of origin of potential foreign fighters are also, of course, still present. And if we look at these factors and many more, of course, there's really the question if that has not the ability to push really a large number of foreign fighters to now travel to Afghanistan and participate in different groups there. However, what has been quite evident in the past years, I would say, is that there has really been no mass foreign terrorist fighter mobilization. And there, I think it's interesting to revisit a report of the sanctions monitoring team now 1.5 years ago, January 2022. And what was interesting is that they found that there was no recent signs that the Taliban has really taken steps to limit the activities of those foreign terrorist fighters already in the country. And there is, of course, a great concern around 6 months after the Taliban takeover that terrorist groups enjoy greater freedom in Afghanistan than at any time in recent history. But however, the first cautious assessment was really that there was only a small numbers of foreign terrorist fighters moving into Afghanistan. And there are a couple of factors that can explain why there has been really only limited movement, or less than expected. So one is that there has been a kind of a shift in the narrative of those potential foreign terrorist fighters and the community at large. So it's contrary to the 80s, 90s, or 2000s, much more of a focus on regional conflicts. So for those wanting to join a jihadist cause, there's really decreased attractiveness to travel to destinations that are very far away, and rather focus on own conflicts that are exploited. There's also, interestingly, at the moment, really an absence of more charismatic figures that might attract foreign fighters to travel to a specific location and join a specific group that has this charismatic leader figure. Also, in Afghanistan, several groups were really not prepared, or were openly communicating that they were not prepared to host or to receive foreign terrorist fighters, especially considering that not all foreign terrorist fighters is an experienced fighter, but they need training, they need hosting, they do not navigate the regional dynamics and so on. So they need, in some cases, kind of babysitting, and not all groups were prepared to do that. So they were really saying, wait a moment, we are not ready yet. Please stay where you are. We are not ready to have you in our country yet, or in our group yet. Also, interestingly, of course, in the past decades, I would say, there has been a real increase in counterterrorism measures when it comes to traveling of foreign terrorist fighters. So there have been much more border control measures, an increase in intelligence sharing, and also more knowledge about travel dynamics and different dynamics of foreign terrorist fighters mobilization. So it has been more difficult to actually travel across countries in that objective. And then also, as some observers have mentioned, there are some logistical aspects, so like real world problems, such as flights have been much more expensive in the past decade, so it's less easier to just hop on a plane and travel across several countries. Also in the past years, there have been some COVID COVID measures restricting traveling. So there's an additional layer of thinking that you have to put in, for example, falsify certificates and so on, that you have to vaccine. So it's an additional layer that might impede the traveling itself. And also, as some have pointed out, there's also a slight Taliban interest to keep terrorist groups at least at bay, since they're depending to some degree on the international community. They're quite cautious also in terms of the narrative they want to construct. So that can be discussed, this aspect, but that aspect also plays into the whole different dynamic that we have in terms of foreign terrorist fighter mobilization. However, there is, of course, if we consider this absence of mass mobilization, some potential threats that I would like to point out. First of all, there are, of course, very motivated and also especially highly experienced foreign fighters that might be relocating from Syria and Iraq. There's a lot of pressure on them there. The situation is not as attractive as it has been. And another potential threats are those foreign fighters coming from countries that are geographically much closer to Afghanistan, so Central Asian countries, China as well, and that have less distance to cross. And then finally, a potential threat, of course, are something that I would like to call stay-at-home foreign terrorist fighters. So individuals that would have traveled in another decade maybe, or in another year, but now can stay at home, can exploit existing networks that they might have. For example, you had networks in Australia, but also in Germany. So basically foreign fighters that stay and are in contact, for example, with leadership in Syria or in Afghanistan. And so what I would also like to do now is to, considering the situation that we expected and that some expected or were fearing, and then seeing that the situation has played out a bit differently in terms of foreign terrorist fighters mobilization, let's look at the recent UN Sanctions Monitoring Team reports, so just a couple of weeks back. And I find some interesting aspects that I would like to highlight that really give another insight in the current dynamics regarding foreign terrorist fighters in Afghanistan. So first of all, in the summary, they mentioned that there are some indications that al-Qaeda is rebuilding operational capability. And then also the Taliban are launching attacks into Pakistan with support from the Taliban. and that, more importantly for our point, the groups of foreign terrorist fighters are projecting threats across Afghanistan borders, and also that IS Khorasan province, our operations are becoming more sophisticated and lethal. So there is a bit of a different conclusion now in this report than from others. And if you look into the individual aspects, so what I mentioned earlier about the potential relocation of Arab countries, now there are first mentions of that happening. So one member state had reported the arrival of 20 to 25 Arab foreign fighters to Afghanistan, and they mentioned the location of camp to train suicide bombers. All of this also accompanied by media apparatus. So this is to say there are not thousands of individuals coming, but there are these, highly motivated, potentially experienced foreign fighters relocating from the Middle East to Afghanistan. Then what I find also interesting is that we do experience a kind of IS built-up in Afghanistan. So the report mentions some individuals from Azerbaijan, Iran, Pakistan, Russia, Turkey, Central Asian countries. And again, here interesting, a small number of Arab fighters traveled from Syria to Afghanistan in the past year. So there is also an aspect of how long individuals will take from one country to another country. So that, of course, doesn't manifest in like a week or two, but also needs more time than maybe anticipated. So here's a real aspect also of timing and continuing to observe the situation. And also the report mentions that there are some new training camps and strongholds built up, at least 5 new ones built in 2020-22. And part of ISKP buildup is also, interestingly, the targeting of ethnic minorities, something also that I mentioned earlier. So there has been a real push to target in campaigns specific members of TTP, so Uyghurs or ethnic Tajik and Uzbek minorities. And so to add on that, Islamic State Khorasan province is paying significantly higher salaries. So they're also trying to attract disgruntled members from other groups. And they're using them in some cases to in suicide operations, and not only suicide, but a specific kind of very lethal attack that combines an attack and a suicide mission, such as the one happened last June 2020-22, a so-called Ingrimazi fighter. So it's a special kind of suicide attack that is considered more sophisticated. And so Islamic State claimed responsibility for that attack, and it was carried out by a Tajik individual who was also responsible for their Tajik media operations. So this is kind of the continuity of that kind of policy. So considering these findings, I would like to mention 3 key insights. So the first one is that, as I mentioned, these kind of pull and push factors for foreign terrorist fighters to travel to Afghanistan do exist, but there's really no major travel movement from Europe, from other countries, not directly after the Taliban takeover and not now, some years later. However, it's really important to focus on quality instead of quantity. So here, as I mentioned, important are experienced and motivated individuals, not the mass. It's important to focus on regional fighters that are specifically targeted by, for example, Islamic State, and also what I wanted to call stay-at-home fighters. So individuals who do not travel for an attack but are already in a country and that are kind of in contact with leadership, for example, in Afghanistan. And then third, which is kind of connected with the second point, of course, that small numbers can add up. So really do not underestimate this kind of trickle, and also do not underestimate returnees. Quickly, some recommendations. So of course, cooperation with transit countries, I think, is really important. For example, checking luggage for relevant spare parts for weapons that were left behind by American forces. Taliban are issuing passports and identity cards. So these kind of numbers can be checked with the Interpol databases. And then also in terms of prosecution, important to also develop a capacity to access evidence found on the ground. And then, of course, as I mentioned, proactively manage these kind of travel movements that are taking place. So a few returnees that we might see, and of course, in general, really important to address the underlying radicalization factors in the countries of origin. So thank you for your attention, and looking forward to your questions.